As we begin our unit on understanding poetry and really beginning to work through our analysis of poetry, there are four main components to poetry that we will be looking at. Now, each poem has one of these components, and we're looking at rhythm, melody, imagery, and form. And so those are the four big pieces that we will be looking at throughout this presentation, and really that we're going to attempt to discover in each of the poems that we focus on. The first element that we will look at is that of rhythm. And just for a little fun, here's a practical use of rhythm that you may not think about every day. Of course, that's not going to work. Here we go.
This annoyed me. I was on the phone with somebody today trying to get a phone number from that person and write it down, but they didn't have phone number rhythm, and that pissed me off. I'm talking about phone number rhythm, especially if there's like an area code involved, like 212, bum bum ba, bum ba, bum ba. That is the rhythm I think we're all familiar with. This guy had no clue. I was like, okay, Hank, give me the number. He's like, all right, it's 2129. 15, 8, 11, 6, 4, 2, 5, 8, 7, 2.
And while that's actually, it's obviously a very humorous way of looking at rhythm, there is a natural cadence to our speech patterns that's attempted to be mimicked in good poetry. So when we begin to look, let's see if we can't move that, okay? So when we begin to look at rhythm, we're really beginning to look in terms of syllables, okay? Now this is where some of those names begin to kind of run together. Now we know that a foot is a two-syllable pattern of a stressed or an accented or unaccented sound, the most common being an I am, and that's the two syllables of the accent and then the accent, de-dum. Okay, away I will. Now, I ams are probably the most common that we will see. Trochee also uses two syllables, but that's kind of the flip. It's the dum-dee, okay? Come mean, do it, okay? So there's the difference in the way that it's stressed. We won't see quite a bit of anapest and dactyl, but that's just the use of the three syllables, and again you can see there the structure of the stressed and the unstressed. Pauses are something that you will begin to look at more closely, especially when we look at very classical poetry. So we have the end-stopped rhyme. That's the pause at the end of a line. We have the caesura, of course. That's the pause that occurs within the line. And then we have enjambé. And of course, that is the line that runs over to the next line without a pause. You really want to focus with enjambé when we're looking at the ideas of punctuation. And so where do those sentences actually begin and end? That's a strategy that I'm always going to encourage you to use when looking at poetry, is to highlight the syntactical units. So if you do have periods, if you do have end punctuation, what's the full syntactical unit to look at? The next element of poetry is that of melody, and this really, of course, has to do with how it sounds. So we have different types of rhymes that we'll be looking at. We have masculine rhyme, that's the one-syllable rhyme, dame, same, love, dove. We have the feminine rhyme, now that's the double rhyme, napping, tapping, weather, heather. The triple rhyme, I think, is very unusual. It's not one that you would focus on a great deal, but of course that's the mournfully. And it really focuses on that each of the syllables matches in terms of the rhyme. We also have sight rhyme. These are two words that look alike but don't necessarily sound alike. So daughter and laughter. We have slant rhyme. Now slant rhyme is very, very common, especially in Emily Dickinson's poetry. These are two words that are nearly rhymed but have a slight variation. So lake, fate, again, rain. You'll see this a little bit. Shakespeare sometimes will use this in his sonnets as well to force the pattern. We have identical rhyme. These are our homonyms. We have end rhyme, which of course is occurring at the end lines of poetry. But then we also have internal rhyme, and that's rhyme that occurs inside a line. Let's beat the heat. Now, I would expect you to know these 5 different types of rhymes and be able to identify them within poetry. We also can look at alliteration. Now, I know that when we think of alliteration, I think we probably all think of consonantal alliteration, and that's the repetition of the consonant at the beginnings of words. But it's not the only type that we see. We certainly have vowel alliteration. Now, that's not to be confused with assonance, because assonance is really looking at the sound that the vowel makes. We also have internal alliteration. So the moan of doves in immemorial elms, I butchered that word, and murmuring of innumerable bees. Now that we're focusing on the letter M, but it doesn't just occur at the beginning of the words, we also have it within. And what it does in that sentence, the murmuring of innumerable bees, it's mimicking the sound, the droning sound that the bees would make. Other sound effects that we're looking at melody, again, assonance, and that's the repetition of the identical vowel sounds. We have consonants. Now, consonants is the repetition of the identical consonant sounds in syllables that have different vowel signs, so bill and ball and born and burn. Onomatopoeia is one that I think that you should always focus on if you have evidence of it, because it's a very strong sensory image then. So it's impacting the audial senses. And of course, we've talked about euphony. That's our good sound. Think of euphoric. And we have our cacophony. That's our bad sound, the harsh clanging sounds together. Imagery is an element of poetry that I think that we're most familiar with and probably feel most comfortable with. Again, when we focus on imagery, we always want to look at denotation and connotation. And I think in looking at these lists of words here, you can see how, while they might be describing the same thing, we have different feelings associated with them. So if you look down at the bottom line there, home, house, shack, bungalow, mansion, crib, pad, hearth, quarters, all of those are referencing the place that someone lives, but we have different feelings, different associations with those words, and that impacts the way that we read a certain poem. I want to make a quick note on imagery here. This is one of those figures of speech which are concrete, okay? It always has to refer to a sensory experience. So the sun perceived by the senses is concrete, the warmth on our face. The enlightenment associated with it is abstract. Now that's perceived by the intellect, it's not the senses. So we can have the image of a peacock, which serves as the vehicle of compassion. Its theme or meaning may be something abstract like vanity or beauty, but the image still has to be concrete. So generally speaking, there are 3 kinds of figures in our speech, and that's comparisons, substitutions, and ambiguities. Okay? A few notes on the idea of comparisons. This is where we have things like analogy, metaphor, simile, personification, and apostrophe. So those are where we're typically making the comparison. We're associating one thing with the other. Allusion, allegory, and a conceit are all examples of these as well. And then, of course, we have symbolism. When we're looking at substitutions, that's when we have metonymy, synecdoche, or synesthesia, and we're substituting in each of those one idea for something else. So synecdoche is the substitution of a part for the whole. When we say all hands on deck, then we're substituting the whole body just for the hands. Metonymy, same way. We're substituting one word for another closely related word. The White House announced. Well, the White House didn't announce anything. We use that in terms of a presidential decree. Okay? Then we have ambiguities. Okay? And then we know that ambiguities are things that can be uncertain. This is where we have hyperbole. Some forms of allegory and conceits can also trigger ambiguities, where we're not certain of these, of the comparison. Okay? So forms we will get into at a later time, where we begin to look at the ideas of ballads, sonnets, epics, villanelles, etc. But for right now, we're going to focus on these parts of the poems. Now, your next step after you identify these is to begin to ask yourself, why has the author used them, and what effect do they intend for the audience there?